Good evening. Please take your scriptures and open them to the book of Daniel, chapter 6. I have been given a text that probably is one of the most famous in all of Daniel. Daniel, chapter 6, very familiar to all of us, and yet I think there are still some profound truths and encouragement we can gather from it. As you're turning to Daniel 6, I just wanted to say I really do think that Daniel's chapters 1 through 5, as Pastor and I have been going through it, has just been so impactful for me personally. I know for Pastor as well, it's been such a blessing. And I'll say one of the things that I've really taken out of it is the fact that God is indeed the king who rules over the other kingdoms of men. And that's unmistakably clear in all of these. And I think Pastor's message this morning was just so timely and important for us to remember, because let's face it, anybody, this can be true of any kingdom, any nation, doesn't matter where it is or who you are, what country you're from, the tendency and slippery slope for each of us is to place a lot of stock in our own kingdom and our own kings and our own rulers, because we assume that that is the highest power there is. But the reality is that Daniel has over and over and over again shown the Jewish exiles and shown us that that's not the case, that God is the one who rules in the kingdoms of men, and he gives it to whomsoever he will, and he takes it from whomsoever he will. Those who have been placed in authority have been placed there by God, and those who have been removed from authority have been removed by God. There's no question about it. And I think that our country would do well, Christians in the United States of America would do well to remember that truth. I frankly do. I'm not saying that Christians shouldn't be looking for morals in their government leaders, that our nation shouldn't be affirming righteousness and things that please the Lord. I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue that, but what I am saying is that there tends to be almost this end-all mindset that unless we do this, it's never going to happen, or unless there's righteous leaders, God's purposes and plans will never be accomplished, as if God needed our help. God has shown in Daniel's chapters 1 through 5 that he is perfectly capable of accomplishing his purposes, and he doesn't need our help. Does he employ us as his instruments to accomplish his purposes? Absolutely. I think Daniel himself is an illustration of that. He's working in a pagan culture for pagan kings. I don't think it gets much more clear than that he is an instrument that God is using even in a pagan culture. But that's not to say that God somehow could not have accomplished any of his purposes without Daniel, because God is free to accomplish whatever he will, with whom he will. And that, again, becomes clear in this most beloved story in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 is probably one that even the unchurched know, or at least have heard of, probably behind Noah's Ark. This story is just so precious, and I think that it illustrates several things for us today. You could divide a lot of what's going on in chapter number 6 here under 5 headings, and these are just headings to outline the text. We'll take 5 lessons from the marketplace, as one of my professors from Maranatha said. We'll take 5 lessons or truths at the end of this. But if we're outlining the actual passage of Scripture, there's 5 headings we're going to do. We're going to see the delegation in verses 1 through 3, the conspiracy in verses 4 through 9, the confrontation in verses 10 through 18, the deliverance, verses 19 through 24, and the declaration in verses 25 through 28. And I know I said that fast, so I'll repeat these as we go along. Let's start with verses 1 through 3, the delegation. Daniel 6 records this: "It pleased Darius," and I'm going to pause just for a second. Pastor, I know, and many of you probably say Darius, and I totally get that, and I will do my best to be consistent, but I have my entire life said Darius, and so I'm just going to probably use that tonight just so you understand. I'm not trying to undermine the way Pastor pronounced it. I'm used to saying it that way, so please forgive me. So chapter 6, verse 1, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm." So, let's just set the stage here. Pastor kind of gave us a glimpse of this morning, but who's this Darius guy? Who is he? There's been a lot of confusion over this, and in fact, some of the people who have sought to undermine the authority of Scripture, and particularly the inspiration of Daniel, has said, yet again, is another point where we find Daniel has created this character that does not exist whatsoever in history. Because at this point in history, there doesn't seem to be any record in the historical records that we have, anyways, at this point, of a guy named Darius. So who is this Darius guy? Well, even though it has been a source of confusion, I do think that there is a logical explanation for it. One of them is that this could be Cyrus himself. We know that, let me back up actually. So you remember in chapter 2, when we looked at chapter 2, there's this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, right? Nebuchadnezzar dreamed that there was this image that had a head of gold, arms and breast or chest of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and then feet made of iron and of clay. It's kind of mixed together. And you'll remember that each of those, Daniel basically was saying to Nebuchadnezzar, as God had given him the understanding of the dream, that each of them represented a kingdom. The head of gold represented Nebuchadnezzar himself, and thereby the Babylonian Empire. Then he said, after you, there's going to come another nation. And it's represented by the chest or the breasts and the arms that are made of silver. And we understand this to be the empire of the Medes and the Persians. I think that's part of why you have the two arms. It's representing the divided nature of these two kingdoms. And that happened in Pastor's text right at the very end, right? In Daniel chapter 5, in verse number 30, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median, or the Mede, took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And we know that at this point there's a king named Cyrus who is essentially the one who did this. And as Pastor shared this morning, it's likely that this guy, Darius, is not actually Cyrus, though some have suggested that. It's likely that Cyrus basically sent somebody to be his co-regent or his leader in the kingdom of Babylon here, and this man is identified as Darius. But the history annals basically record likely that this man was named Gubaru, 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 who ruled as a governor of Babylon from 539 to 525 BC at the appointing of Cyrus. You'll notice, remember at the end of chapter 5, it says in verse 31, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 60 years. If you have a different translation, it probably says something like received the kingdom. That's essentially what we would use to defend the identity of Darius as Gubaru, that he was given the kingdom by somebody else. He was appointed as this ruler. So, for sake of clarity and succinctness here, I'm going to say that this guy is named Gubaru, but we'll call him Darius because that's what Daniel calls him in Daniel chapter number 6. So, Darius decides to do what? Well, in chapter 6, verse 2, it says, in verse 1, it pleased him to set over the kingdom 120 princes. You could translate this as governors or satraps. They're basically officials over various provinces in the kingdom. So what Darius decides to do is he says, hey, I'm not going to do all this by myself. I'm going to send a whole bunch of people who will go in and govern these various provinces, and they'll be responsible to me. But then he actually even subdivides it further, and he says in verse 2, over these 120 governors or princes or satraps, he says in verse 2, over these 3 presidents. So over these 120 guys, we're going to have 3 presidents, or perhaps your translation says commissioners, high officials, or chief overseers. These are the guys that are going to watch over these 120 satraps or governors. And all of this was basically to be a safety measure for Darius. Because, let's face it, you've seen so far at this point, Jehoiakim has been ransacked, and Nebuchadnezzar took care of him, and took care of all of the Jewish people, and so now he's got them. And then Darius the Mede, through really Cyrus, goes and finally takes over the Babylonian Empire. It's like transition of power after transition of power. They're like, okay, let's do everything we can to protect the power that we have. So we're going to have these governors sent out, and then we're going to have 3 guys who are over them. And guess who one of them is? Daniel. This has been something that has happened over and over again in the entirety of the book of Daniel, is the ones who are faithful to God have marked themselves in the eyes of these pagan people. They have been clearly identified as leaders, hard workers, diligent, and obviously they've shown that they have fidelity to those who they're working under. Because why would Darius, or why would Belshazzar, or why would Nebuchadnezzar, any of these guys, put Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in these leadership positions if it weren't for the fact that they trusted them? They were trustworthy men, and I believe they were trustworthy because the Lord was blessing their faithfulness to him. They remained unwavering in their commitment to him. So Daniel is one of these 3, and basically these 120 satraps are going to come, or governors, are going to come to Daniel and these 2 other guys, and they're going to report to them so that they then all have this safety measure in place to protect Darius. But as you would expect, the Lord continues to bless, just like he blessed Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph? Joseph in Genesis? He's essentially sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up being bought by Potiphar and working for a guy named Potiphar. And what ends up happening with him? He's so well respected by Potiphar. He does such a good job and is diligent in his work that Potiphar promotes him and basically says, yeah, you can be over everything except for me and my wife. And then, of course, Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, doesn't work. She lies about him. He goes to jail. And then Joseph in jail. What happens while he's in jail? He's just faithfully serving the Lord, saying, you know what, I don't understand why the Lord's doing this, but I'm just going to keep being a person of integrity, diligent character, be someone who is of righteous character. And what ends up happening in jail? He's promoted in jail. I mean, they just trust him implicitly. And then the Pharaoh ends up having a dream, and through Joseph, the Lord gives the interpretation, and then Joseph is promoted to the second in the land. I mean, the blessing of a faithful life is clearly evident, and over again, the Lord does that. And yet again, in the book of Daniel, he does it, because in verse 3, Daniel was preferred above the others because, notice this, an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. I mean, this guy has shown an excellent character. And I believe that excellent character has been because he has trusted the Lord, he has faithfully served the Lord, and he has obeyed the Lord, and the Lord's just blessing him. The Lord is blessing Daniel for his faithfulness. So Darius delegates all of this authority, and Daniel ends up being one of the preferred men. So that's the delegation, verses 1 through 3. Then we come to the next one, the conspiracy. This is verses 4 through 9. And like in chapter 3, with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or better known probably to us as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's faithfulness was quickly noticed by his superior and by those who hated them. Look at verse 4. Then the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Unreal. These guys are filled with envy. They're power hungry. They want the position of power and prestige. They want to be recognized as someone who is worthy of all the authority by Darius or Cyrus. And so when Daniel is shown to be one who is faithful, he has a consistent character and integrity, and as a result, even these pagan rulers are recognizing him and his qualities, that the people who demonstrate they have the exact opposite character of Daniel, they notice it too. And they become green with envy. And so in verse 4, they sought to find occasion against him, but they could not find any occasion, nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Verse 5, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. You know what's really interesting? Up to this point in chapter 6, Daniel has said absolutely nothing about his fidelity to Yahweh, to the Lord, to Jehovah. He said nothing about the fact that he has consistently prayed 3 times a day, that he has sought to be faithful to the Lord in his prayer life, in his personal integrity, in everything. I mean, it seems like it's obvious that he had a heart for the Lord and he was willing to let that be on display for anybody. So much so that Daniel, as he's recording this book, decides to let these men of low degree and questionable character introduce that very thought. Because they recognize that even though they have done everything they could to determine whether or not they could get him in his character, they said, actually, we've got a better idea. Let's take his very character and use it against him. In fact, in some ways, their idea was somewhat ingenious. Because they say, and it says then in verse 6, then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and thus said unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdoms, by the way, is that true? All of them? Who's among these presidents and governors and princes and counselors and captains? Who's among them? Daniel. So are these guys even starting out with the truth? I don't think so. They say, all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. So these guys come up with this brilliant strategy. Here's how we'll get Daniel. We're going to trap him in his own righteous character. Let's go to Darius, and let's get him to get really egotistical. Let's basically say, you know what, King Darius? We just want people to show their loyalty to you. Because this is the whole premise here. They want the king to think that this whole thing is a test of loyalty. King Darius, set up a test of loyalty. And here's how we want you to do it. We want you to create this decree that nobody can appeal to anyone. And by this appeal, we're talking about a religious appeal. I don't think what they're saying is when he says they shouldn't ask a petition of any god or man, they're not saying you can't ask for your neighbor or a cup of flour. I don't think that's what they're saying. They're talking about a religious appeal. Anybody who wants to make a religious appeal of any kind to their gods, if they do that, they should be cast into a den of lions. So King Darius, here's who they should be talking to. They should be talking to you. See, if they're really going to be showing fidelity to you and to our nation, then they'd be willing to give up their gods and any of their other friends and people they might ask petitions of or bring these requests for. They'd be willing to give them up for 30 days, King Darius. This is a test of their fidelity. If they truly are faithful to you, if they're true people of character, then they will be people who will only talk to you because you, King Darius, and notice the ego petting here, you, King Darius, you are like one of the gods. And this really was part of the pagan culture. It was not uncommon for pagans to view their king as a god, as a descendant of the gods. In fact, in ancient culture, and this is actually really fascinating, I wish I had time to tell you about it. I'm taking a class right now at Detroit called Pentateuch, and it's basically going over the first 5 books of the Bible. But before we got to them, we basically did an examination of the ancient Near Eastern culture prior even to when Moses was alive. Because if you think about it, Moses, there's at least, 2,000, 3,000 years of history that happens before Moses even writes. So there's a lot of history in ancient Near Eastern culture that is really fascinating to learn. And one of the things that we've learned basically about some of that ancient culture is that the pagans would frequently view their king as a descendant in some way of the deities, of the gods. And I think, honestly, it was a very brilliant way of manipulating the people into doing anything you wanted them to do. Because if you said something, it was as if the gods were saying it. So this is no surprise. This is out of nowhere. For us, if someone were to go to our current president and basically say, yeah, we should make this decree that anyone should only pray to you and not to their gods, and then we'll know if they're truly faithful to you and to America. To us, that would be like way bizarre and out of the blue. We'd be like, what in the world? That's weird. But for this culture, that was not uncommon at all. This would be something that would be normally in keeping with the pagan cultures around them. So it's no surprise then, when you get to verse 9, that Darius actually does this. He actually says, yeah, he's not like, wait, that's weird. Why are you asking me to do that? He actually signs the writing into decree. And I frankly believe he's doing this because they have convinced him, one, that he is the greatest. I mean, Darius, man, you're that and a whole bag of cheese. I mean, you are amazing, buddy. And I think too, I mean, he's just been placed over Babylon here, and he essentially wants to know, are these guys really going to be faithful to me or not? So he's thinking in his mind, yeah, I actually am the greatest, and the greatest deserves the best, and the best would be the ones who are faithful to me. So yeah, for 30 days, let's do this. Not realizing that the very plan that these wicked men were doing was to trap one of his favorite advisors, as I think we'll see in a moment. So this conspiracy together was essentially dreamed up by these guys so that they could exploit Daniel's open allegiance to his God. And King Darius has no clue what's about to happen. So he says, yeah, let's do this. And you'll notice it says in verse 8 that they wanted him to establish the decree and sign the writing that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. You recognize that they recognized that Darius really liked Daniel. Because I think they knew in the back of their minds, if this were a law that could change, and Darius finds out that Daniel actually has been praying to his God instead of to this pagan king, that Darius, because he loves Daniel so much, would have immediately saw through the wicked reasoning and conspiracy of these men and would have immediately changed the law. But they're really shifty, and they said, hey, we're going to ask you to sign this law with the Medes and Persians. And this is not unfamiliar to us because in the book of Esther, you'll note in chapter 1, verse 19, and in chapter 8 and verse 8, that this was something that was consistent throughout that culture, that this law that was made of the Medes and Persians was something that could not be changed even by the highest in the land. So the one who basically disobeyed the decree had their fate sealed, because there was nothing anybody could do to save them. And this, I think, is part of Daniel's questioning and literary genius here, as the Holy Spirit is having Daniel write this down. Implicitly in the Jewish reader's mind, and hopefully in yours as well, is this question. Oh no, the law of the Medes and Persians, Daniel's sunk. Boy, he better not pray in front of these guys, otherwise he is sunk. There's no getting out of it. There's no rescuing him. Daniel's just probably smiling as he's writing this down, thinking about what his readers would think as he writes this, and they might be wondering, what's going to happen to Daniel? Is he going to actually be faithful, and is he going to show his allegiance to his God, or is he going to just maybe covertly pray or maybe even avoid doing any of that until those 30 days are done? So these wicked officials basically say, let's do this. There's one thing I want you to note. This is the main part of the story that we all know well, is that they give stipulations for what happens to the person who disobeys the decree. It says in at the end of verse 7, anyone who does not ask a petition of you, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, that is also foreign to us because we, frankly, don't punish people by keeping a den of hungry lions and saying, all right, if this person has disobeyed this decree or this statute or this law, toss them in there. That's our execution method. We don't really do that. But what's interesting is that historical annals and records have shown that this was actually almost a preoccupation with some of the Assyrian and Persian culture, was lions. They had this preoccupation with them, and they would capture these lions and they would keep them in this pit that would descend down into the ground. And there was basically a wall that they would build, essentially creating this den for these hungry lions. And they would feed the lions through that door, but they would also use these lions as weapons to punish evildoers. And I mean, frankly, no person would get out of there. Let's put it that way. I mean, their preoccupation with lions and the fact that I'm sure they did everything they could to make sure that these lions were hungry, which is, by the way, an important note to the story of Daniel here, and we'll talk about that at the end. But the fact that they had this preoccupation and they were consistent here. They said, it doesn't matter what the law is, we're going to execute you. And they had lots of different ways, but one of the ways they were really preoccupied with was a den of lions. And that's, again, no surprise to Daniel's readers. They would have easily remembered Persian and Assyrian culture like that and known, oh yeah, there's one in this city and there's the lion's den over in this city. And oh, I remember this person was thrown in there because they disobeyed the king or there was a conspiracy against the king. This would have been no surprise. And this is a very specific request because they want this to be one of the cruelest ways to kill Daniel. I mean, you'll find out at the end of the story that these lions didn't waste any time killing anything that went inside their den, their pit. So this was a very cruel way. Shows you the sadistic way with which these men wanted Daniel to be killed. So we move now then from the conspiracy, verses 10 through 18, to the confrontation. Verse 10, Daniel's readers are wondering, what's he going to do? Verse 10, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went to his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Daniel's unwavering in his commitment to his God over and over and over again in these first 6 chapters. There's essentially this conflict that's created by Daniel as he's writing this down, and there's this question in the reader's mind, what's going to happen? Are they going to be faithful or not? Chapter 1, are they going to eat the king's meat or not? Chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are they going to bow to the image or not? Over and over again, the conflict has been raised and the question has been raised, what are they going to do? And Daniel, every time, says, chapter 1, we're just going to be faithful. We don't want to defile ourselves with the king's meat. Chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're not going to bow down. We understand the penalty. We understand what's at risk, but we're not going to do it because we're going to show fidelity to our God. And Daniel, once again, chapter 6 says, I'm going to show fidelity to my God. I'm going to not change a thing. Could Daniel have maybe done what Jesus said? Remember Matthew 6? When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, the Pharisees who want to basically go forth and sound the trumpets and let everyone know, just so you know, I'm about to pray. I'm going to pray with eloquent words that will wow all of you. My oratory is amazing. Or when Jesus says, don't be like them. When you pray, go into your house and go in your closet where no one can see you and pray so that your praying is before the Lord and not for men. And maybe someone's saying, what? Didn't Daniel understand that? I mean, he didn't have to pray in front of everybody. He didn't have to do it the same way. Couldn't he have just maybe forgone it for a little bit or maybe hidden and not done it in public? He could have. But Daniel was not about to let these bullies pressure him into doing what he believed was the right thing to do, and that was to be faithful to God openly. Remember how I said in chapter 1, the one thing they knew about him clearly was that he loved his God. There was no question in their minds about that. And in fact, they recognized it's the only way we're going to get him. And Daniel says, I'm just going to be faithful to my Lord. I have seen him. At this point, Daniel's old. Daniel is in his later years of life. Daniel could have basically said, you know what, this is just too hard. I've had a long life now. I don't want any more trials and struggles. But Daniel, all throughout his life, has been faithful to God in spite of his dangerous circumstances. Daniel has shown fidelity to his God and said, that is more important to me than life. And ironically, God granted to him long life because of it. So Daniel's faithful. You say, well, why is he going to his window and open up his window and praying towards Jerusalem? Well, you'll remember in 1 Kings chapter number 8, Solomon is praying at the dedication of the temple. And he said this when he prayed to the Lord back at the dedication of the temple in, I believe it was 960 BC. When your people go out to battle against their enemy, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name, then hear in heaven their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause. 1 Kings 8:44. You have, and 45. You have Solomon saying, Lord, when those who are your children go through a testing time, they're surrounded by enemies, they're in horrible circumstances, Lord, when they pray towards your holy city and the temple that we've built, hear their prayer. Defend them. And I wonder if that was going through Daniel's mind. If maybe he was praying in his window and said, Lord, I'm just trying to be faithful. I'm just trying to be someone who's pleasing to you. And Lord, I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why these guys hate me so much. I just want to love you. I just want to obey you. I want to be faithful to you. Our people are in captivity because they refuse to be faithful to you. I don't want to be like them. I want to be faithful. I want to show you that your people can be faithful to you. That perhaps Daniel was thinking about Solomon's words and his prayer to the Lord in 1 Kings 8:44 and 45. And Daniel consistently prayed this way. Prayed this way 3 times a day, it says. In the King James, it says he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day. Essentially, they're saying this is what he would normally do. He would normally pray 3 times a day. In fact, I'm just going to mention in Psalm 55, this is really fascinating. Psalm 55, this is a prayer, or a psalm, I should say, of David. And he says in I guess I'll start in verse 12. For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I would have borne it, neither was it he that hated me, that did magnify himself against me, then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man of mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked unto the house of God in company. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwelling and among them. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. And notice this, verse 17. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. God shall hear and afflict them, even that he that abideth of old. Basically, I wonder if perhaps this was also going through Daniel's mind. Morning, noon, evening, I'm just going to pray to the Lord. I want to do this every day. I want to pray towards his temple. I want to show him that I want to be faithful. I want to show him that his people can be faithful when they humble themselves. So Daniel decides to pray upon his knees, a posture of humility, 3 times a day, consistently, and to give thanks before his God as he did before. He says, Lord, I don't know what's going to happen, but you're good. So what happens? Verse 11. You can almost hear the wicked glee in verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God, like, oh boy, we got him now. Verse 12. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed, king, that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions? King, do you remember your little law that you wrote? And the king answered, probably questioning in his mind, like, what's going on here? He said, yes, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. You can almost hear the disdain in their voice. They don't even say he is one of those Jewish people. He's one of your high officials. No, they're like, that captive of Judah. That kind of sounds familiar, right? In chapter number 3, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego Abednego are basically refusing to fall down, that there were certain Babylonians or Chaldeans that came to Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, "O king, thou hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, all these musical things shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." And then in verse 12 of chapter 3, "There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." I mean, the disdain and hatred these men have for faithful, God-fearing men. And notice that both of these conniving groups made the same accusation when they say, "They have not regarded thee." Said it in verse 12, and then over here they said in verse number 13, that Daniel, who's the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree thou hast signed. They're like, "We got him. He's sunk now." They thought that they had him. And Darius at this point, it says in verse 14, the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. You can sense the anguish in Darius' soul. What have I done? I've been tricked. These guys have tricked me into executing my favorite, my most faithful, my most trusted official. And it's at this point, Darius immediately knows what has happened. These guys have tricked me. It's not that he's upset that Daniel has not prayed to him. He's upset that one of the faithful, trusted, older advisors and officials in his land has been tricked, and he can do nothing about it. Darius, the great king, I'll put that in quotation marks, of this land right now, is absolutely helpless. Hasn't that kind of been what Daniel has been showing in all the other chapters? These great kings, you think that you can set your hope in them? You think that they're going to rescue you and save you? These kings are helpless. They're only placed there by the highest power there is. And Daniel is just setting this table so perfectly for his readers, because now they're like, "Oh no! Daniel is going to go in the lion's den. Darius is absolutely helpless. There's nothing he can do." And Darius goes all day long saying, "What can I do?" And he has his advisors search for every loophole he can think of to get out of this. And he can't. And so in verse 15, these same men, these same wicked men of vile character, assembled unto the king and said unto the king, "Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed." Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. And there's this little quote that's so interesting. "The king spake and said to Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee." And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. In other words, what they did was they rolled the stone in front of this den, and then they chained it up. And then these seals that they would use were these soft, pliable clay tablets that they would place over the chains. And then the king would take his signet ring and stamp it on there, and so would all of those apparently of his other advisors and high officials, so that basically once it hardened, the only way to get inside there was to break those seals and to break the chains. In other words, Daniel, pardon the pun, your fate is sealed. You're not getting out of there. No one's going to rescue you, and you can't get out. And it's at this point that Daniel probably just stops writing for a second and just thinks in his mind, can you just imagine what my readers might be thinking if I stopped the story right there? Like, what happened to Daniel? It's like one of those stories with the cliffhanger and the guy just doesn't finish the story and you're like, what happened? I got to know. It's the perfect cliffhanger. An older man who's been faithful but wrongly accused of infidelity to his king when all he was doing was showing his faithfulness to his God is thrown into the den of lions. And you find this interesting that there's nothing described about what's going on in the lion's den until later. Like, at this point, if this were a movie, like, Daniel has written the perfect script for it. Because then you go from the from verse 17 where the stone has been essentially, rolled over in the front. They sealed and everything. It gets to verse 18. It's almost like the cameras pan over then at night to King Darius' bedchamber. And there in verse 18 that the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Essentially, he's like, I can't sleep. I can't handle this. And you're thinking in your mind, who cares what Darius is doing? I want to find out what's going on in the lion's den. Are they tearing him up? What's going on? What does this look like? Daniel says, not yet. You got to wait. And that's where we move then from the confrontation to verses 19 through 24, the deliverance. Verse 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went and hastened to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice. You can see he basically doesn't think Daniel's alive. He's doomed, essentially, in his mind. He's like, Daniel's dead. There's nothing but bones down there, maybe. He cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? And here is the question of the entire story of Daniel 6. Is God able to? Because guess what? Darius isn't. Darius is absolutely helpless. There's nothing he can do. This is the question that Daniel is answering in Daniel 6. Is God able to do this? And hopefully the reader of the previous 5 chapters has gotten used to answering that question with, yep, God's definitely able of doing it. Because in verse 21, I can just imagine, if this were a movie, if Daniel were to make this into a movie, after the king cries out and says, is your God able to deliver you from the lions? That Daniel, just with a twinkle in his eye, puts just a little pause. Like, did he? And then verse 21 happens. Then said Daniel to the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. So you have Daniel, he doesn't defend himself whatsoever prior to this. He has not said a peep until this point. And there's some fascinating things about this, and I've already gone long, so I'll just quickly mention them. Basically, he says, my God hath sent his angel. And you say, well, who's that angel? Is it Michael? Like, what angel is this? And I believe that this is the angel of the Lord, really the pre-incarnate Son of God. I really do. I believe that this is the pre-incarnate Son of God. Just like in chapter number 3, it's really inconclusive. You can't say 100% either way, but I believe that it really is Jesus Christ, the pre-incarnate Son of God. And there's other instances of that, Genesis 16, 11 through 14, Genesis 22, 15 through 16, Judges 6, 11 through 26, 1 Chronicles 21, 16 through 18. All of those talk about the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ. I believe that is who God sent in to shut the lions' mouths. Can you imagine Daniel, this old man who's just faithfully trying to serve the Lord, sitting in the lion's den all night long with Jesus? Jesus is just sitting there and he's keeping the lions over there. The same Jesus who calmed the storm with a word. The same Jesus who commanded demons to leave the demoniac of Gadara. The same Jesus who raised the dead, who healed the blind, who healed the sick. I believe is the same one who said, lions, stay over there. Just stay over there. Just commanded with a word. And thereby demonstrated the answer to the question that King Darius asked. Is God able to deliver? Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Not only that, but he also says, before him, before him, before my God, I was innocent. I had done nothing wrong. I was faithful to him first. And before you, O king, just so you know, in the order of importance here, the Lord found me innocent. I just want you to know, before you, I've done nothing to hurt you. I've done nothing to disrespect you. I have been faithful to you. And the king, verse 23, then he was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him because he believed in his God. Daniel says, Jewish reader, did you get that phrase? You're in captivity right now. You're experiencing God's judgment. But guess what? The one who believes in God gets blessed. Do you remember that, Jewish reader? Do you remember that, Christian? The one who believes in God is blessed. That's not to say that God will deliver you just like he did Daniel in the same way. But maybe his deliverance is to be absent from the body, is to be present with the Lord. I can't think of a better deliverance than that. So what happens to these other men? Well, the men who wanted to malign Daniel's character through their own wicked character are commanded, verse 24, to be brought. These men who had accused Daniel were to be brought, and they cast them into the den of lions, them and their children and their wives, which to us seems like, wait, what did their children and their wives do? This is in some ways part of their culture, but I think in part of ways part of God's judgment. Part of God's judgment. And lest you think that the lions were like, oh, well, Daniel lived not because his God saved him. That's way too far-fetched. They were probably old, maybe missing a few teeth, probably blind. They couldn't see anymore. Some of them were probably a little too fat to chase him. Lest you think any of that, it says that when they threw these guys in, the lions had the mastery of them and break all their bones in pieces wherever they came to the bottom of the den. They didn't even reach the bottom, and they were gone. They were ripped up, they're eaten. Showing you that this had to be an act of God. That's the only explanation there was. And so then the deliverance, I'm going quickly because I've gone long, but we go from the deliverance then to the declaration, verses 25 through 28. The king Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and steadfast forever, in his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And then that's the end of the story. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Basically, the king makes a declaration and says, every single one of you better fear this God. Psalm 99, we don't have time to go there, but I believe it's Psalm 99, verse 1, if I remember correctly, talks about the Lord reigneth, tremble before him. This is something that I think so many Christians do not understand. We want to make God like this cuddly little friend, and I'm not saying that God hasn't come near to us and that we cannot go boldly before his throne of grace and that we do not have a loving Father. I'm not saying any of that because we do. We have a loving Father who loves us and is near us. But Daniel has shown over and over again in his book that God is a king who rules. And through this pagan king Darius, he says, you need to tremble before him, fear him. Do you see his power? Darius, were you able to deliver Daniel from the lion's den? No, you weren't, but his God was. And his God has an everlasting kingdom that shall never change. And that's been a theme over and over again. Even this morning, as Pastor was sharing with us, Belshazzar did not learn from the lesson of Nebuchadnezzar, where Nebuchadnezzar learned that God rules in the kingdoms of men. Belshazzar did not understand that. And so the Lord gave his kingdom to the Medes and to the Persians. And now Darius is making that same proclamation again. God reigns. And we would do well to remember that. We would do well to remember that. Well, I'll just mention these last things then. What were the lessons from the marketplace? What does Daniel teach us? I'll just read them. Number one, Daniel teaches us that those who faithfully serve God can know that persecution will come. Daniel has done nothing wrong. He says that. He says, before my God I was innocent. Before you, I did what was right. I didn't do anything to hurt you. And yet he still suffered persecution. And Paul writes in 2 Timothy 3:12, yes, all those who love and live in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It's inevitable. So we can do all we want to try set up laws in the American land, and in other nations they can set up laws and do everything they can to try prevent it. But Jesus has assured us, and the scriptures are unequivocally clear, that just because you live in seemingly perfect circumstances does not mean you will not be persecuted for your faith. Number 2, God brings trying circumstances to prove the genuineness of our faith. Can you imagine if Daniel had not been faithful, what would have happened? This story might have ended totally differently. What if Daniel had said, you know what, yeah, I'm just not going to pray to God for the next 30 days. Or you know what, I guess I will pray to Darius. It's just, I know I'm not praying to him. He's not God. 1 Peter writes that the trying of your faith produces endurance. I think James actually says that, but in 1 Peter he says that the trying of your faith proves the genuineness of your faith. Daniel was just showing his true fidelity to God by his obedience to him. Number 3, this is basically what Darius asks. Is your God able to deliver you? The answer is yes. God is able to deliver his saints. God is able to deliver his saints. Look, if our nation one day gets to the point where Christians are persecuted, is God able to deliver us? And the answer is unequivocally yes, he is. Does it always mean we'll be miraculously delivered like Daniel was? No, but God's not obligated to do that. And in some ways, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. How could that be bad? Number 4, those who accuse God's saints will not go unpunished. Remember in Revelation, there's the blood of the saints who are persecuted for the faith, and they're asking, how long, Lord? How long? And the Lord says, just wait. Their time is coming. For Daniel's accusers, it was very quick. For some of us, we may wonder, Lord, are you ever going to let these wicked receive their just reward? And because the Lord is infinite in patience, it's just something that I don't have. If I see enemies who are blaspheming the name of God and persecuting Christians, my thought is, Lord, get him! Get him! But God is infinite in patience. In fact, Paul says he saved me so that he might prove and demonstrate his infinite patience towards us. But in the end, those who accuse God's saints will not go unpunished, including the ultimate accuser, Satan himself. And number 5, God will even use the harshest of circumstances to glorify his name. What ends up happening in Darius's exclamation and in his declaration? Does he say, I want all you peoples to listen up. Every single one of you must now give answer and bow down before Daniel? No. He says, you all need to fear and tremble towards Daniel's God, because this was his God that did this. And so just like that, God will glorify himself even in the harshest of circumstances. It doesn't matter who's reigning and ruling in whatever nation it happens to be. It could be the wickedest person. It could be the most righteous person that ever lived. But God will still glorify his name regardless. And Daniel demonstrated that out of the lion's den. Lord, I thank you for your people who love you and hear these precious truths patiently. Thank you for your infinite patience. Thank you for your mercy. Pray that you would help us to be people who trust you, who believe in you, and who recognize that whatever happens, Lord, we want to be faithful to you regardless of the cost. And we know, Lord, in answer to Darius' question, you are able to deliver, and we are thankful for that. Amen.